The dining table gleamed under the glow of candlelight, with the diamond necklace nestled in its velvet box winking at Rob, almost mocking him. Tonight was supposed to be perfect, a celebration of their 5th anniversary, but Andrea's words shattered the moment like a glass dropped on marble. "I think we need an open marriage," she said, her voice calm, rehearsed. Rob froze, disbelief etched into every fiber of his being. "An open marriage?" he repeated, his voice trembling with a mix of shock and betrayal. Andrea's silence screamed louder than her words, and suddenly, the future he had envisioned crumbled before his eyes. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you're enjoying this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future stories. The dining room was a picture of warmth and elegance. A pair of flickering candles cast soft golden light across the table set for 2. Fine china, polished silverware, and a bottle of vintage wine were arranged meticulously, each element chosen to reflect the care and thought Rob had put into this evening. In the center of the table rested a small velvet box, barely visible behind a delicate bouquet of roses. The diamond necklace inside sparkled like a promise yet to be fulfilled. Soft piano music drifted through the air, blending with the faint hum of the city outside. Rob adjusted his tie, his reflection in the mirror revealing a mix of excitement and nervousness. Tonight marked their 5th wedding anniversary, a milestone he had been looking forward to with anticipation and pride. He glanced at the clock, then toward the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the open door. Everything was perfect, at least on the surface. The dining table gleamed under the glow of candlelight. The diamond necklace, nestled in its velvet box, seemed to wink at me, as if it knew a secret I didn't. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. It wasn't. Rob couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. 5 years of marriage, a roller coaster of joy, challenges, and small victories. From the first time he saw Andrea walking down the aisle, glowing in her white dress, to their shared dreams of traveling the world and building a family. Life hadn't always been easy, but their love had felt strong, unshakable. He pictured the moment now, when they'd take a few days to the beach, when the kids could relax and feel the sun. Lately, though, something had shifted. Andrea had grown distant, her once bright laughter replaced by quiet sighs. She had taken to spending more time with her friend Jessica, staying out late and returning with vague explanations. Rob had told himself it was just a phase, perhaps stress from work or the monotony of routine. Had I missed something? A sign? A moment where things began to crumble? He wondered as he lit the candles on the table. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Tonight was about celebration, not doubt. Oh, the sound of the front door opening pulled Rob from his thoughts. Andrea walked in, her coat draped over her arm and her expression unreadable. She looked stunning in her emerald dress, the one he had bought for her birthday last year. Yet there was something in her posture, a hesitation, a guardedness, that made Rob's stomach tighten. "You look beautiful," he said, stepping forward to kiss her cheek. She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks," she replied, her voice unusually subdued. As they sat down to eat, Rob tried to engage her in conversation, recounting a funny incident from work and asking about her day. Andrea's responses were curt, her attention drifting toward the window. She was afraid of having feelings for people and so tried to live up to a role as a mother. "You seem off tonight," Rob said after a moment, forcing a smile to mask his concern. Andrea glanced at him, her fork paused midair. "I'm fine. Just tired." "Tired?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. "It's our anniversary, Andrea. Are you sure everything's okay?" "I said I'm fine," she replied, a hint of impatience creeping into her tone. She took a sip of wine, avoiding his gaze. The room grew quieter, the tension palpable. Rob felt a knot tighten in his chest. Andrea set her glass down and folded her hands in her lap. "Rob, there's something I need to talk to you about." Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed, but the words sent a chill down his spine. "What is it?" he asked, his tone cautious. She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the napkin in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about us. About what I want, what I need." Rob leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Okay. And what does that mean?" Andrea took a deep breath, her eyes finally meeting his. I think we need to open up our marriage." For a moment, Rob thought he hadn't heard her correctly. What are you saying?" he stammered, his voice cracking. I think it's something we need," Andrea continued, her tone steady but detached. "For us. For me." His mind raced, struggling to process her words. Open marriage? After 5 years of commitment, vows, and shared dreams? And who was... "You want to see other people?" he asked, his voice rising. Andrea's gaze dropped to the table. "I think it's the only way for us to grow. To rediscover ourselves." Rob's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. The diamond necklace, still sitting in its velvet box, seemed to mock him. "This isn't growth," he said, his voice low and trembling. "This is betrayal." The perfect evening Rob had envisioned was gone, shattered by the weight of Andrea's words. As the candles flickered, casting long shadows across the room, he realized that nothing about this night, or their marriage, would ever be the same again. The responsibility of candle mastering had been his in the past, not Andrea's, and he needed to figure out how he would balance the needs. The car ride home was a blur. The city lights streaked past, muted and distant, as Rob gripped the steering wheel with knuckles as white as the moonlight filtering through the windshield. His chest felt tight, each breath shallow and labored. He could still hear her words echoing in his mind, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. An open marriage? Andrea? My Andrea? The thought spiraled, looping endlessly. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped bird. The taste of something metallic coated his tongue, a bitter cocktail of anger and disbelief. He pulled into the driveway, the familiar sight of their home now alien, a facade for something broken. Inside, the house was quiet, the weight of her words filling every corner. He sank into the couch, his head in his hands. Was this real? Was this my life? The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd promised forever to, was asking for a hall pass to sleep with other men. His stomach churned, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Every memory of their life together felt tainted now, as though he'd been unknowingly living a lie. Bam. By the time Andrea walked through the door, Rob's emotions had boiled over into a simmering rage. She entered with an air of calm, setting her purse down as though nothing monumental had occurred. The sight of her composure only fueled his anger. "So this is it?" Rob's voice broke the silence, sharp and raw. "This is what you've been thinking about? Sleeping with other men while I sit at home playing the good husband?" Andrea flinched slightly but recovered quickly. "Rob, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" he interrupted, standing up abruptly. "Help me understand, because right now it feels like a knife in my back." Her arms crossed defensively. "It's about honesty, about being true to ourselves." "Honesty?" Rob laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and venomous. "This isn't honesty, Andrea. It's betrayal wrapped in pretty words." Andrea held her ground, her voice eerily calm. "You think I wanted to feel this way? To question everything? I'm trying to figure out who I am, Rob. I've been losing myself in this marriage." Rob's fists clenched at his sides. "So your solution is to throw me aside, to rediscover yourself in another man's arms?" "It's not about throwing you aside," Andrea replied, her tone unwavering. "It's about growth, for both of us." "Growth?" Rob's voice cracked under the weight of his anger and disbelief. "This isn't growth, it's destruction. You're burning everything we built together." Andrea's calm began to falter, her voice rising slightly. "I'm trying to save us. Do you think I'm the only one struggling here? I've felt like I'm suffocating, Rob, like I don't even know who I am anymore." Rob paced the room, running a hand through his hair. "And you think this will fix it? That bringing other people into our marriage will somehow save it? I think it's worth a try, she said quietly, her eyes finally meeting his. Because if we don't, I don't know what's left. Rob stopped, the finality of her words hanging heavy in the air. He stared at her, searching for something, regret, guilt, anything to show that she understood the gravity of what she was asking. But her expression was resolute, almost detached, and it was in that moment he realized something had changed. Not just tonight, but long before this conversation. You're right, he said finally, his voice low and cold. There's nothing left. Andrea blinked, taken aback. Rob, I didn't mean... Don't, he cut her off, his hand raised. Just don't. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that comes only after the breaking of something irreparable. Rob couldn't bring himself to look at her anymore. He turned away, his hands trembling as he gripped the back of the chair to steady himself. The anger, disbelief, and sadness churned together into something dark and unmanageable. This is what you've been thinking about while I've been working late, planning surprises, trying to keep this thing we built together strong? His voice cracked, but he didn't care. You've been sitting there, deciding that growth means cutting me out of the equation. Andrea sighed, her tone shifting to something softer, almost pitying. Rob, I'm not cutting you out. This isn't about us falling apart. It's about finding ourselves. Finding yourself? He spun around to face her, his eyes blazing. You can't find yourself inside someone else's bed. Or maybe you can. Hell, what do I know? The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to slice through glass. Andrea flinched but pressed on. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I think in the long run it could make us stronger. Stronger? Rob's laugh was loud and cruel, echoing through the room. Stronger? You think inviting other people into our marriage makes it stronger? That's not strength, Andrea. That's weakness. Her eyes narrowed. You're not listening. I need this, Rob. I've felt trapped for so long, like I'm disappearing. And I've been right here the whole time, he said, his voice softening momentarily. What about me, Andrea? Do I get a say in this? Or are my needs just collateral damage in your self-discovery? She hesitated, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. That pause was all the confirmation Rob needed. His hands ran through his hair again, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of the chaos swirling inside him. Do you even love me anymore? Andrea's silence was deafening. She didn't look away, but her hesitation spoke volumes. Exercise. Right, he whispered, nodding slowly. That's what I thought. The room felt like it was closing in. The warmth of the candles, the cozy familiarity of their home, none of it mattered anymore. It all felt like a cruel joke. Finally, Rob broke the silence. If you need to find yourself, Andrea, fine. But you're not going to do it under this roof. You want this? This open marriage? He gestured around the room. Then you can leave. Take your things and go. Andrea's mouth opened in shock. You're kicking me out? I'm setting a boundary, he replied, his voice steady but full of pain. You can't have it both ways. If this is what you really want, then you can't stay here pretending everything's fine. Rob, I don't want to leave. You already did, he interrupted, his voice cold. The moment you made this decision without me, you left. She stared at him, her calm facade finally cracking. For the first time, tears welled up in her eyes, but Rob didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. Not now, maybe not ever. Andrea took a shaky breath, nodded once, and turned toward the bedroom to pack a bag. As her footsteps faded down the hall, Rob sank back onto the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of the evening settled heavily on his shoulders. The person he thought he knew, the life he thought he had, was gone. All that remained was the silence of a house that no longer felt like a home. Andrea moved through the house in silence, her footsteps soft but deliberate as she packed her things. The sound of drawers opening and closing echoed faintly, a stark contrast to the usual hum of life that once filled their home. Rob stood in the living room, his arms crossed, rooted in place as though moving would break the fragile composure he clung to. Each sound, The zip of a suitcase, the rustle of clothing, felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage. He didn't offer to help, nor did she ask. The air between them was heavy, thick with words left unsaid. As Andrea emerged from the bedroom, her arms full of hastily packed bags, she paused at the doorway. For a moment her eyes softened, a flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossing her face. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, breaking the silence. Rob's jaw tightened. "No, Andrea, you don't have to do this." "But you already made your choice." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't want it to be like this." "And yet, here we are," Rob replied, his voice devoid of the anger that had consumed him earlier. Now there was only exhaustion. "You wanted freedom? You've got it." Andrea didn't respond. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, a determined look settling on her face. She stepped toward the door, her suitcase wheels dragging slightly over the hardwood floor. As she reached the threshold, she turned back, leaning against the doorframe. Her confidence returned, her voice steady and resolute. "This isn't goodbye," she said, her tone almost daring. "I'll be back. You'll see." Rob didn't flinch. He met her gaze with a calmness that surprised even himself. "Don't mistake my silence for waiting," he said firmly. "You made your decision. Now live with it." Andrea lingered for a moment longer, as if expecting him to stop her, but he didn't move. When she realized no words or looks would break his resolve, she finally stepped out. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound reverberated in Rob's chest like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was overwhelming, an emptiness that seemed to seep into every corner of the house. For a long time, Rob stood motionless, staring at the door. The life he had known, the woman he had loved, had just walked out, and despite her parting words, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end of something irrevocable. Slowly, he turned and walked back into the living room. The diamond necklace still sat on the dining table, untouched, a cruel reminder of the night that had unraveled everything. He picked it up, the cold metal heavy in his hand, before tucking it back into the velvet box. As he sat down on the couch, the weight of the silence settled over him once more. But this time, it was different. It was a silence he chose to face, one that might finally give him room to heal. The house felt cavernous without her. Every sound, from the faint creak of the floorboards to the soft hum of the refrigerator, seemed amplified in the emptiness. Rob sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the TV screen that played a show he wasn't watching. The characters moved, the dialogue filled the room, but it was all background noise. His focus was elsewhere, scattered among the memories that now haunted every corner of their home. In the kitchen, the remains of the anniversary dinner sat untouched. The candles had burned out hours ago, leaving melted wax pooled at their bases. Plates of food, once carefully prepared, now sat cold and forgotten. The velvet box with the diamond necklace still lay on the table, unopened, a cruel symbol of what could have been. Days began to blur into one another. The mornings were the worst, waking up to the sight of her side of the bed, unmade and untouched. The indent where she used to sleep lingered, as though the mattress itself hadn't yet adjusted to her absence. Rob found himself staring at it for too long, unable to bring himself to smooth it out. It felt like erasing the last trace of her. At night, he tried to distract himself with TV or the occasional book, but his mind always wandered back to Andrea. What was she doing now? Was she with someone else already? The thoughts came unbidden, sharp and unrelenting, like thorns digging into his chest. He would shake his head, trying to push them away, but they always returned. The house itself began to reflect his inner turmoil. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink, a half-empty coffee mug sat on the living room table for days, a ring of cold liquid at the bottom. Clothes were strewn across the bedroom floor, a mess he couldn't bring himself to clean. The effort felt futile. What was the point of keeping things tidy when his life felt like chaos? Rob started taking long drives at odd hours, the quiet hum of the engine the only thing that seemed to soothe him. He didn't have a destination, he just needed to get out, to escape the walls that felt like they were closing in. Sometimes he parked by the lake and sat in his car, staring at the water. The stillness mirrored the ache inside him, a vast expanse of emptiness that stretched endlessly. Friends began to call, leaving voicemails that he couldn't bring himself to return. They wanted to check in, to ask how he was doing, but he didn't have the energy to explain. What was there to say? That his wife had chosen a life that didn't include him? That every corner of his house reminded him of what he had lost? Even the simple act of eating felt like a chore. Meals went uneaten, replaced by quick bites of whatever was easiest to grab. Cereal, a piece of toast, a handful of chips. The joy of cooking, something he had once loved, was gone. The kitchen now felt like a hollow, empty space, its warmth extinguished, along with his marriage. One evening, as he sat on the couch with the TV flickering in front of him, Rob noticed something he hadn't before: the quiet. It wasn't just the absence of Andrea, it was the absence of himself. He felt like a ghost in his own home, going through the motions but not truly living. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time in days, he let himself feel the full weight of his grief. His shoulders shook as tears streamed down his face, the bottled-up pain finally finding its release. The loneliness, the betrayal, the emptiness, it all came crashing down at once. But as the tears subsided, something shifted. The quiet was still there, but it no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a blank canvas waiting to be filled. The silence was no longer just a reminder of loss. It was a space to rebuild. One morning, after yet another restless night, Rob stood by the window, watching the world outside his quiet house. Cyclists sped past on the street, their brightly colored jerseys flashing in the sunlight. They moved with purpose and energy, a sharp contrast to the stagnant haze that had consumed his days. Something stirred inside him, a faint desire to feel alive again, to do something other than sit in the hollow silence of his home. Later that day, Rob found himself researching local cycling groups. The idea felt foreign, almost daunting. He hadn't been on a bike in years, but the thought of joining others, of finding some semblance of normalcy, was appealing. A quick search led him to a group that met twice a week at a nearby park. Before he could overthink it, he signed up. The first ride was harder than he anticipated. As the group gathered, Rob felt out of place among the seasoned cyclists. Their sleek bikes and confident chatter made him second-guess his decision. But then a middle-aged man named Dave approached, his grin warm and inviting. "First time?" Dave asked, gesturing to Rob's bike, which was noticeably less advanced than the others. "Is it that obvious?" Rob replied, half smiling. "Nah, we've all been there," Dave said with a wink. "Stick with me, and I'll make sure you survive." The ride was grueling, the uphill stretches testing Rob's stamina. By the end, his legs burned, and his lungs felt like they were on fire. But as he sat with the group afterward, sipping water and swapping stories, he felt something he hadn't in weeks: a sense of belonging. Over the next few rides, Rob started to find his rhythm. The physical exertion became a release, each push of the pedals a way to burn off the anger and sadness that had weighed him down. The group welcomed him with open arms, their camaraderie a balm for his frayed spirit. It was during one of these post-ride gatherings that Jessica appeared. Andrea's friend was hard to miss, her presence bold and unfiltered. She wasn't part of the cycling group, but had shown up to meet a mutual acquaintance. When her eyes landed on Rob, a sly smile crept across her face. "Well, if it isn't the lonely husband," she said, sliding into the seat next to him. Rob stiffened, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Jessica," he acknowledged tersely. She leaned in, her voice dripping with mock concern. "How's the single life treating you?" "Better than expected," he replied evenly, refusing to rise to her bait. Jessica laughed, shaking her head. "You know, Andrea's doing just fine. Plenty of guys lining up to take her out. She's living her best life, you might say." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Rob didn't let it show. He took a slow sip of his water, his gaze steady. "Good for her," he said simply, refusing to give her the reaction she seemed to want. Jessica raised an eyebrow, surprised by his calm. "Well, if you ever want to know what she's up to, I've got all the details," she said with a smirk, before turning her attention to someone else. Yep. That night, Rob lay awake, Jessica's words replaying in his mind. Andrea was dating multiple men. The thought was both infuriating and oddly freeing. It confirmed what he had suspected but hadn't wanted to confront. She had truly moved on. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, but it also stirred something else: resolve. The cycling group had given him a glimpse of what life could be outside the shadow of his failed marriage. He wasn't there yet, but each ride, each connection, was a step closer. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow as the cycling group gathered for an evening ride. Rob adjusted his helmet, mentally preparing himself for another round of uphill struggles and sore legs. He was getting stronger, but the challenge remained. As the group exchanged greetings and jokes, a new voice broke through the chatter. "Is this where the amateurs meet?" The voice was light, teasing, and unmistakably confident. Rob turned to see a woman walking toward them, her bike slung over her shoulder. She had a bright smile and a natural ease about her, the kind of presence that drew people in. Dave greeted her enthusiastically. "Diane, about time you joined us." "I thought I'd give you guys a chance to catch up," she quipped, setting her bike down with practiced ease. Her eyes swept over the group and landed on Rob. "You're new." "Relatively," Rob replied, offering a small smile. "Rob." "Diane," she said, extending a hand. Her grip was firm, her handshake confident. The ride started off as usual, with Rob keeping pace and focusing on the rhythm of his pedaling. Diane, however, seemed to have no problem keeping up, occasionally glancing over at him with a mischievous grin. "You're doing pretty well for someone who's still breaking in those legs," she teased during a brief water break. Rob smirked, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Still breaking in? I've been cycling since before you were born." She raised an eyebrow, her grin widening. "I'm 35. "Exactly." Her laughter was genuine, a sound that seemed to cut through the heaviness Rob had been carrying. For the rest of the ride, she stayed close, occasionally throwing out playful remarks that kept the mood light. Yeah. After the ride, the group settled into their usual post-ride gathering spot, a small cafe by the park. Diane slid into the seat across from Rob, her water bottle in hand. "So, what got you into cycling?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. Rob hesitated, debating how much to share. "Needed a change. Something to focus on." She nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, sometimes a new direction is exactly what you need. I started cycling during nursing school. It was either that or lose my mind." Rob chuckled. "And did it work?" "Mostly," she said with a shrug. "Though I did crash into a mailbox on my second ride." The image made Rob laugh, a sound that felt foreign but welcome. "I'll keep that in mind if I ever need to dodge one." "You should," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I hear they hold grudges." Over the next few weeks, Rob and Diane found themselves gravitating toward each other during the group rides. Their conversations flowed easily, a mix of lighthearted banter and moments of surprising depth. Diane had a way of making Rob feel at ease, her warmth cutting through the lingering shadows of his past. One evening, after a particularly grueling ride, Diane suggested they grab dinner. "You've earned it," she said, tapping his shoulder. "Besides, I need someone to commiserate with about these hills." They found a quiet diner nearby, where the conversation continued effortlessly. Diane talked about her work as a nurse, her love of travel, and her plans to train for a long-distance cycling event. Rob found himself sharing more than he expected, about his struggles, his recent past, and his hope to find some sense of balance again. "You've been through a lot," she said softly, her eyes filled with empathy. "But you're here. That counts for something." Rob nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "It doesn't always feel like enough." "It is," she said firmly, her hand briefly brushing his. "Sometimes just showing up is the hardest part." The rides took on new meaning for Rob. They were no longer just a way to escape his isolation. They became moments to look forward to, a chance to connect with someone who made the world feel lighter. Diane's presence was steady and genuine, a stark contrast to the turbulence he had known with Andrea. One night, as they rode side by side under a canopy of stars, Diane glanced over at him. "You know, you're not bad at this cycling thing." "Not bad?" Rob feigned indignation. "I'll have you know I'm practically a pro now." She laughed, her smile lighting up the darkness around them. "Okay, pro. Let's see if you can keep up." She surged ahead, her laughter ringing out as Rob grinned and chased after her. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt alive again. Not weighed down by the past, but propelled forward by the promise of something new. The nightclub was alive with flashing lights and pulsing music, a blur of colors and sound that Andrea had come to embrace as her new normal. She sipped on a cocktail, her laughter mingling with the chatter of the men who surrounded her. Dressed to impress, she exuded confidence, her smile dazzling and practiced. From the outside, it looked like she was thriving, a woman who had traded the monotony of married life for excitement and freedom. But the nights always ended the same way. Hours later, as the last strains of music faded and the crowd thinned, Andrea found herself sitting alone in a rideshare, staring out at the city lights. Her reflection in the window seemed distant, almost unfamiliar. By the time she stepped into her friend Jessica's apartment where she had been staying, the glamour of the evening had faded completely. The heels came off, the makeup was wiped away, and the silence of the empty room swallowed her whole. The men she met were charming at first, showering her with compliments and attention. They bought her drinks, whispered sweet promises, and for a brief moment made her feel desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. But as quickly as they appeared, they disappeared. A few unanswered texts, a missed call, and then nothing. She told herself it didn't matter. This was what she wanted, freedom, no strings attached. But the sting of rejection lingered each time. It was subtle at first, a nagging ache she tried to ignore. Over time, it grew harder to dismiss. Jessica, always the cheerleader of Andrea's newfound lifestyle, tried to reassure her. "Men are like that," she said one evening as they sat on the couch scrolling through dating apps. "It's a numbers game. The next one will be better." But even Jessica's enthusiasm began to wane as Andrea's pattern became apparent. Each new relationship followed the same trajectory. Intense beginnings, quick flameouts, and Andrea left picking up the pieces. Jessica's patience wore thin, her comments becoming more pointed. "Maybe you're trying too hard," she said one night, watching Andrea swipe through photos. "Or maybe you're looking in the wrong places." Andrea snapped back, defensive. "I'm just living my life, Jess. Isn't that what you said I should do?" Jessica shrugged, but her silence spoke volumes. Yeah. The cracks in Andrea's new life became harder to ignore. Nights out turned into longer stretches of emptiness, the excitement of the chase giving way to a hollow routine. Her confidence wavered, her once bright smile dimming. She started avoiding mirrors, unable to shake the feeling that the person looking back at her was a stranger. One morning, after a restless night, Andrea woke up feeling unwell. At first, she chalked it up to another late night, a hangover perhaps, or stress. But as the symptoms persisted, she decided to visit a doctor. The news hit her like a punch to the gut. She had contracted an STD. The doctor's words were clinical, factual, but they felt like accusations. Shame and fear swirled inside her as she left the clinic, clutching a prescription and avoiding eye contact with everyone she passed. The humiliation was compounded by another blow a few weeks later. She was pregnant. Andrea sat in stunned silence as the doctor confirmed what the test had already told her. "Do you know who the father might be?" the doctor asked gently. Andrea's throat tightened. She didn't have an answer. As the days turned into weeks, Andrea's world began to unravel. The men she reached out to, those she had dated in the past months, either ignored her calls or outright denied any responsibility. One of them, a married man, reacted with anger, threatening to expose her if she tried to involve him. Jessica, once her confidant, grew distant, her support eroded by the weight of Andrea's choices. "You need to figure this out," she said one evening, her tone flat. I can't keep cleaning up your messes." Alone in the apartment, Andrea's glamorous nights felt like a distant memory. The heels and dresses she once wore with pride now sat untouched in the corner of the room. The reflection in the mirror, once ignored, now haunted her. The confident, carefree woman she thought she had become was gone, replaced by someone she barely recognized. One particularly cold night, Andrea found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand. She hovered over Rob's number, her finger trembling above the screen. A part of her wanted to call, to explain, to beg for help, but she couldn't bring herself to press the button. The thought of facing him, of seeing the disappointment in his eyes, was too much to bear. She set the phone down, her hands shaking. The silence in the room felt suffocating, a stark reminder of the choices that had brought her here. As tears slid down her cheeks, Andrea realized that the freedom she had chased so desperately had come at a cost she hadn't anticipated. She was left with nothing but the consequences of her decisions. A life she had once thought would be full of excitement and possibility, now marked by loneliness and regret. The nights out, the fleeting relationships, the endless pursuit of something undefined. It all felt meaningless now. And for the first time, Andrea began to understand the true weight of what she had lost. The air was crisp and cool as Rob and Diane walked their bikes along the edge of the park, the sun dipping low on the horizon. They had just finished a long ride, one that had left them both pleasantly exhausted and craving the quiet simplicity of each other's company. The once unfamiliar dynamic between them had grown into something comfortable, something real. It wasn't rushed, nor was it weighed down by expectations. It simply was. As they reached a bench overlooking the lake, Diane leaned her bike against a tree and gestured for Rob to sit beside her. He hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by the serenity of the moment, before settling in next to her. "Do you ever feel like life has a funny way of pulling you in directions you didn't expect?" she asked, her voice soft but curious, as she gazed out at the water. Rob thought for a moment, his eyes following the ripples spreading across the lake. "More than I'd like to admit," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I guess that's the point, isn't it? You end up exactly where you're supposed to be, even if it's not where you thought you'd go." Diane turned to look at him, her expression warm but probing. "Do you think this is where you're supposed to be?" Rob met her gaze, surprised by how easily he could answer. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think it is." Their relationship had started as a simple friendship, forged on bike trails and shared laughter. But as the weeks passed, it deepened into something more. Conversations that had once been light and surface level grew richer, filled with stories about their pasts, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Diane spoke of her demanding but fulfilling job as a nurse, the nights spent comforting patients, and the moments of gratitude that made it all worthwhile. Rob, in turn, opened up about his divorce, the betrayal he'd endured, and the ways it had forced him to reevaluate what he truly wanted in life. He admitted one evening as they sat beneath a sprawling oak tree after a ride, "I don't feel like I have to be anyone other than myself. I didn't realize how much I needed that until now." Diane smiled, her eyes softening. "That's all I've ever wanted, just someone who's willing to show up and be real." What struck Rob most about Diane was her steadiness. With her, there were no games, no veiled accusations, no unspoken resentments. She was open and kind, her compassion evident in the smallest of gestures, a quick text to check on him after a tough day, the way she listened intently when he spoke, the laughter she brought into his life. Being with her felt like rediscovering a part of himself he'd thought was lost. On one of their quieter evenings, as they shared a meal in her cozy kitchen, Rob found himself reflecting aloud on the changes he had gone through. "I used to think that loyalty meant holding on, no matter what," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But now, I think it's about showing up for the right people, the ones who show up for you." Diane nodded, her fork pausing mid-air. "Loyalty isn't about suffering through something that breaks you," she agreed. "It's about building something that lifts you up." Her words lingered in his mind long after the evening ended. They echoed in the quiet moments when he was alone, reminding him of how far he had come and how much further he could go. One weekend, Diane invited Rob to join her at a charity event she was volunteering for, a bike ride to raise money for a local children's hospital. As they rode together alongside dozens of others, Rob couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The ride wasn't about him or his struggles. It was about something bigger, something good. Seeing Diane in her element, interacting with people, offering encouragement and smiles, filled him with a quiet admiration. "You're amazing, you know that?" he told her later as they rested under a canopy of trees, sipping from water bottles. Diane laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I think you might be biased." "Maybe," he admitted, a grin breaking across his face. "But it doesn't make it any less true." As the months passed, Rob began to notice changes in himself. The heaviness that had once consumed him was slowly lifting, replaced by a growing sense of peace. He no longer avoided mirrors or dwelled on the past. Instead, he looked forward, to the rides, to their conversations, to the quiet evenings spent in Diane's company. One night, as they sat on her back porch watching the stars, Diane reached for his hand, her fingers curling gently around his. "You know," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I didn't expect this, us, but I'm glad it happened." Rob squeezed her hand, the warmth of her touch grounding him. "Me too," he said, his voice carrying a certainty he hadn't felt in a long time. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again, but with you, it just feels right." The stars overhead shimmered, casting a soft glow over the two of them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rob allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something new, something whole, something that wasn't tied to the pain of his past, but built on the promise of his future. It was a quiet Saturday morning when Rob heard the knock on his door. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, as an unsettling feeling crept over him. When he opened it, Andrea stood on the other side, her expression a mix of nerves and forced optimism. "Hi, Rob," she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to hint at vulnerability. He stepped back instinctively, unsure of what to say. "Andrea?" She took his silence as an invitation and stepped inside, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. The sound, once familiar, felt intrusive now. Her eyes roamed the living room, as though searching for something that still belonged to her. "This place looks the same," she said awkwardly, setting her purse on the counter. "I wasn't sure if you'd changed anything." Rob crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "What are you doing here?" Andrea turned to face him, her expression shifting to something more deliberate. "I've been thinking about us, about everything." She paused, waiting for him to respond. When he didn't, she continued, "I made mistakes, Rob, big ones. But I want to make things right." Yeah. Rob's eyes narrowed, his arms tightening across his chest. "Make things right?" His voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Andrea, you walked out that door months ago. What makes you think you can just walk back in?" She flinched at the sharpness of his tone, but pressed on. "I wasn't myself. I didn't know what I wanted, but I do now. I miss us, Rob. I miss what we had." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "What we had? You mean the marriage you decided wasn't enough for you? The one you traded for freedom?" "Rob, please," she said, her voice cracking. "I know I hurt you, but I was confused. I thought I needed to find myself, but all I found was that I already had everything I needed, with you." Rob stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and deliberate. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Her breath hitched, and she looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I thought I would, but no, I didn't." "Of course you didn't," he said, shaking his head, "because it wasn't out there. It never was. Except in the case..." Andrea stepped closer, reaching out to touch his arm, but he pulled back, the distance between them growing wider. "I love you, Rob," she said desperately. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. I can fix this." He shook his head, his voice steady but firm. "No, Andrea, you don't love me. You love the idea of me waiting for you, of me being here to pick up the pieces while you destroy everything we built." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment she seemed truly vulnerable. "That's not fair. I've changed. I know what I want now." "You want comfort," Rob shot back, "not commitment. There's a difference, and I'm done being the safety net for your bad decisions." The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." Rob's gaze hardened. "I didn't throw it away, Andrea. You did. You made your choice when you left. You don't get to rewrite history just because the consequences weren't what you expected." She stood there, her tears flowing freely now as the reality of his words sank in. "So that's it? You're just going to shut me out? After everything?" "I didn't shut you out," Rob replied, his voice soft but resolute. "I opened the door. You're the one who walked away." Andrea lingered for a moment longer, her face a mix of shock and despair. Finally, she grabbed her purse and turned toward the door. "I hope you're happy," she said bitterly, her voice trembling with frustration. "I am," Rob said without hesitation, "for the first time in a long time." She looked back at him one last time, as if searching for some sign of weakness, some crack in his resolve. But there was none. With a resigned sigh, she stepped outside, the door closing softly behind her. Yes. As the silence settled over the house, Rob stood there for a moment, his emotions swirling. But unlike the emptiness he had once felt, this time there was clarity. Andrea's return had been a test, not of their marriage, but of how much he had grown. And for the first time, he felt free, truly free. The days following Andrea's unexpected visit passed in a blur for Rob. He replayed their conversation in his mind, but instead of feeling conflicted, he felt a calm sense of certainty. Andrea's return had clarified what he had long suspected. There was no going back. The trust they once shared was irreparably broken, and the person he was becoming no longer fit into the life she had left behind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rob found himself at Diane's place. They sat on her back porch, sipping tea and listening to the cicadas hum in the distance. The peaceful atmosphere was a stark contrast to the turmoil he had faced just days ago. "Something on your mind?" Diane asked, her voice gentle but perceptive. Rob hesitated, then nodded. Andrea came by. Diane's expression remained neutral, but her eyes searched his face. "And?" "She wanted to come back," Rob said, the words heavier than he expected. "Said she was ready to fix things." "And what did you say?" Diane asked, though the answer was clear in her tone. Rob sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I told her no, that it was too late." Diane's lips curved into a faint smile, her eyes softening. "Good." That simple word, good, solidified what Rob already knew deep down. Diane wasn't just someone who had helped him heal. She was someone who valued him, respected him, and offered the kind of partnership he had always wanted. With Andrea, there had always been doubt and imbalance. With Diane, there was clarity and mutual care. Diane was clear. She was pure and mutual. The next day, Rob decided to put the past behind him for good. He packed away the remnants of his marriage, photos, letters, and the diamond necklace that had never been given. As he placed them into a box and tucked it into the back of a closet, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making room for the future. Meanwhile, Andrea was beginning to realize the full weight of her choices. At first, she had convinced herself that Rob's refusal was temporary, a knee-jerk reaction to her mistakes. She believed he would come around, that he still loved her enough to forgive. But as the days turned into weeks with no word from him, doubt began to creep in. One evening, Andrea found herself scrolling through her phone, staring at photos of their life together. Vacations, birthdays, quiet moments at home. All the memories she had once taken for granted now felt like treasures she had recklessly discarded. She called Jessica, hoping for reassurance. "He'll come back," Andrea said, her voice tinged with desperation. "He always does." Jessica hesitated, her tone less certain. "I don't know, Andrea. He seems different now. Stronger." Andrea's chest tightened. But I was his wife. Doesn't that mean anything? Jessica sighed. It did, but you left, remember? Maybe you should have thought about that before. As Andrea grappled with her regret, Rob and Diane's relationship continued to flourish. One weekend, they went on a cycling trip together, exploring winding trails and stopping at small cafes along the way. It was simple, unpretentious, and filled with laughter, a stark contrast to the drama and tension that had defined his marriage to Andrea. During one quiet moment by a lake, Diane turned to him. You know, I've never asked, why did you start cycling? Rob smiled, the question pulling him back to a time that now felt like a lifetime ago. At first, it was just a way to escape. But now, he looked at her, his gaze steady. Now it feels like moving forward. Her hand slipped into his, a small but significant gesture. Here's to moving forward then. Andrea's realization came too late. One afternoon while running errands, she spotted Rob and Diane together at a local park. They were laughing, their bikes propped against a bench as they shared a picnic. The ease between them was undeniable, a stark reminder of what Andrea had lost. She wanted to approach, to say something, but her feet wouldn't move. Instead, she stood frozen, watching from a distance as Rob leaned in to kiss Diane. It wasn't a passionate display, but a tender, natural moment that spoke of trust and connection. It was everything Andrea had once had and thrown away. Tears stung her eyes as she turned and walked away, the full weight of her actions pressing down on her like never before. For the first time, she understood that there was no going back, no fixing what she had broken. As the weeks turned into months, Rob continued to move forward with Diane by his side. They built a life together, one filled with shared goals and mutual respect. He no longer felt haunted by the past or defined by the betrayal he had endured. Instead, he felt free to live, to love, and to embrace the person he had become. And though Andrea's regret would linger, it remained hers alone to carry. Rob had made his decision, and it was the right one, for both of them. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of pine as Rob and Diane strolled along a wooded trail near their favorite lake. Their laughter echoed softly, mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. Diane had convinced Rob to take a weekend off for a camping trip, a new experience for him, but one he'd quickly grown to love. It was another small adventure in the series of moments that had begun to define their relationship, simple, genuine, and full of promise. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Rob stood by the edge of the water. Diane was nearby, unpacking their picnic dinner, completely unaware of what he was about to do. Rob took a deep breath, reaching into his pocket to retrieve a small velvet box. The gesture felt symbolic, as though he were rewriting a chapter that had once carried so much pain. "Diane," he called softly, and she turned, her face lighting up with curiosity. He dropped to one knee, the world seeming to pause around them. Her hands flew to her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. "Rob, you've shown me what love is supposed to be," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Kindness, respect, trust, all the things I thought I'd lost. I can't imagine moving forward without you. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, the weight of the past fell away completely, replaced by the quiet joy of the moment. They stood together, holding each other as the stars began to emerge, their future full of possibilities. Their wedding was intimate, a celebration of love rather than spectacle. Close friends and family gathered at the same lake where he had proposed, the setting as serene and genuine as their bond. Rob felt lighter than he ever had, no longer shackled by the pain of what had been. Diane was his partner in every sense of the word, a source of strength, laughter, and unwavering support. Reflecting on his journey, Rob realized how far he had come. Betrayal had shattered him, but it had also forced him to rebuild, stronger, wiser, and more open to what truly mattered. Sometimes, he thought as they danced beneath the stars, it takes losing everything to understand what you deserve. Andrea's mornings were no longer filled with glamour or excitement. Instead, they started with the cries of a baby and the overwhelming fatigue that came from sleepless nights. She rocked her infant son in the dim light of her modest apartment, the soft hum of a white noise machine the only sound besides his tiny whimpers. Her days were consumed with diapers, feedings, and trying to balance her work as a part-time administrative assistant. The high-energy nightlife she had once embraced now felt like a distant dream, or perhaps a nightmare. Her designer dresses hung unused in her closet, reminders of a life that had crumbled beneath her feet. She had no support system. Jessica, who had once been her closest friend, had distanced herself after Andrea's series of reckless choices. The men Andrea had dated were nowhere to be found, most having disappeared the moment responsibility reared its head. She hadn't even bothered trying to contact the potential father of her child, knowing the answer would be the same: rejection. At work, the whispers were constant. Colleagues who once admired her confidence now gossiped about her fall from grace. The shame followed her everywhere, a shadow she couldn't escape. Still, Andrea pushed forward, determined to make the best of her situation for the sake of her son. He was the one bright spot in her life, a reminder that not everything was lost. But the nights were the hardest. When the baby was finally asleep, Andrea often found herself staring at her phone, scrolling through old photos of her and Rob. Their smiles, their laughter, it all felt like another lifetime. She had convinced herself back then that leaving him was the right choice, that freedom was worth the risk. Now, all she felt was the weight of her mistakes. One evening, she came across a picture of Rob and Diane. They were standing by a lake, their arms wrapped around each other, their smiles genuine. Andrea's chest tightened as she realized just how happy he looked, happier than he ever had with her. She set the phone down, tears streaming down her face. Sometimes, she thought, the hardest lesson is realizing you can't undo the damage you've caused. Andrea's journey was far from over, but it was hers to walk alone. She vowed to be better, for herself and for her son. The road ahead was daunting, but it was the only path left. As she kissed her baby goodnight, she whispered, "I'll make this right for you." Rob and Andrea's stories diverged sharply, each shaped by the choices they had made. For Rob, the betrayal had become a catalyst for growth, teaching him the importance of self-respect and the value of a true partnership. For Andrea, it was a painful reminder that actions have consequences, and some mistakes leave scars that never fully heal. In the end, life had a way of balancing the scales. Rob found happiness not because he sought revenge, but because he chose to rebuild. And Andrea, she carried the weight of her choices, a lesson in the fragility of trust and the cost of taking love for granted. Sometimes letting go isn't just about moving on, it's about making room for the life you deserve. And for Rob, that life had only just begun. Plus,